This is going to be a doozy. And this story is actually quite appropriate for the times that we're living in right now. My name is Priscilla with Cilla Travel, helping you live the dream through travel. And we're here to talk about Tanzania, the story that no one put on the brochure. How about that? And yeah, there is a lot to talk about. And it's quite relevant to the times that we're living in right now. I own a travel company and I help active adults and empty nesters and the dink travel with heart, heritage, soul, and adventure. And we're here to talk about the story that no one put in the brochure, and it's about an African country, Tanzania. So, Tanzania and beyond, it's more than just safari. So, a lot of times, or most of the time, right? We think of East Africa, Southern Africa as safari destinations, but that's not all that there is to these countries. Tanzania is in East Africa, next to Kenya, and Zambia on the other side, and it also touches Uganda and Rwanda. So, East African countries, they are in the business of safari, but there's also a story. There's a lot of stories because there are people who make their living from doing safari. So just like we in the United States have tourism and our companies, friends, family, restaurants, hotels, tour guides make a living out of tourism, showing the world our country or our city or our town. So does Tanzania. But today we're about to talk about what's beyond Tanzania and safari. So here's where we're going to begin. And this is something that people, Black African Americans in the diaspora in the United States, had questions about. This is a question, excuse me, that African Americans asked themselves back in the 1960s. And the 1960s was a time of the civil rights movement. And why am I talking about that now? Because it's relevant right now. It's relevant right now. We're talking about the civil rights movement because it is absolutely relevant right now. So, this is where we begin. If freedom can be handed to you and then taken back, then what does real freedom even look like? And where do you find it? So that's a question that many during the civil rights era asked themselves. And now here we are again in 2026, asking ourselves that again. So my parents were pretty active during that time. I was actually born during the end of I can't say the end. I was born in the early part of the civil rights movement and in the 60s. So, but I was small. My parents were active. My mom wasn't as active because she had two small kids, but they made sure that we understood what was going on in the country. And what was going on in the country was a lack of what we call civil rights, really human rights, a lack of voting rights, a lack of political power, a lack of humanity. That is what the African American Black community was facing. And our community has been facing that for generations, from the time that Africans were brought to this continent, even before America was America. So next month, we're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding of America. But African Americans, Black Americans were here long before the country was a country. So, and we've been fighting for rights and to be thought and treated equally ever since. We've come a long way, but there are forces which are trying to reverse the gains that we have made in this country. So, a generation of Black Americans asked this once, and now they're asking it again. If freedom can be handed to you and then taken back, what does real freedom even look like? So, and this is where we begin our saga. You probably already know Tanzania for these reasons. For the great migration, the great wildebeest migration that occurs year-round through Tanzania and neighboring Kenya, where these herd of wildebeest, and they've been doing this for millennia, they continue to do it. They migrate from the Serengeti across the border into Kenya, into the Mara, and then come back and cross this river. And people have been fascinated with this event for generations, decades. People have been fascinated with this. The wildebeest and the zebra travel together, but guess what? The predators follow them. So, depending on what time of year it is, will depend on where the herds will be and what will be going on. Will it be calving season? That means when they're having their babies. Will it be a season where they're mating, or will it be when they're just traveling looking for better food? Because the Serengeti dries up certain times of the year during the dry season, so they migrate to across the Mara River in Kenya where it's greener, and then they come back. So we know about that. We know about the Great Migration. We also know about Mount Kilimanjaro. Mount Kilimanjaro is the tallest mountain in Africa, the continent, and many people have climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and still do. You can even get a tour to Mount Kilimanjaro if you want to climb. There are many routes, so people go there constantly, every year, train to go climb Mount Kilimanjaro. You don't have to climb all the way up to the top, but people do. I've been there, but of course I did not climb to the top. I did a little bit and then had to turn around and come back. Now, we also know Tanzania for offering the safari of a lifetime. So whether you're there for the Great Migration or whether you're there just for the wildlife and safari, Tanzania is the real deal. There are many national parks where people come from all over the world to watch the wildlife, not like in a zoo, not like on TV, not like in a circus, but where they live. And each country and each area that offers safari has their own way of doing it, because all safaris are not alike, because all areas are not alike, the distances are not alike, and the national parks are not alike, as well as not the people, the communities, and the landscape. They're not all alike, but we do know Tanzania for these three things. However, did you know that Tanzania was once the headquarters of the African liberation? And did you know that Dar es Salaam was once where freedom fighters came from across the continent, and they actually ran their freedom and liberation movements out of that one city in Tanzania? So how many people knew that? Dar es Salaam, that's a coastal city. And these are the headquarters represented on my slide, because during that time, the African nations were they were actually fighting for freedom from colonialism. Okay. So the countries we know in Africa. There are 54 of them. They were former colonies. Before the colonies, they were just African nations with their own borders, their own people, their own civilizations. But after the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s, 1880s, I believe, Europe divided up the continent and moved in and displaced the people. We don't really know a lot about that unless you do some extensive reading and research about it, which I decided I'm going to do. We just know about colonization. The United States, before it was the United States, was a colony. Okay, so it was British North America. Then Florida was a Spanish colony. Now, South America are mainly Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and Central America, mostly Spanish and Portuguese colonies, mostly Spanish colonies, the countries that we know of now, but they were all former colonies of European countries. During the Age of Discovery, they started searching, the Portuguese did, searched for a route to the East, India, where the spice trade was. Mainly, there were other reasons. They also knew there were people, and they knew about gold. They were also seeking for gold. So, the Mediterranean was controlled by the Ottomans. So, the Portuguese wanted to find a route. So that's what pushed them to circumnavigate, starting from the west coast all the way down around the Cape of Good Hope until they got to the east coast, all the way up, and found a route to India. But along the way, they discovered and made trading partners with different African nations or groups. And it took hundreds of years for the transatlantic slave trade to actually become industrialized. It didn't happen all at once, and all those people were not the same. And there were many kingdoms. A lot was going on. But fast forward into the late 1800s, the European powers met in Berlin for the Berlin Conference and discussed splitting up the continent of Africa. And then they said, let's see what we could do here. Let's try to carve up this place, force our way in. It started with trade, of course, but force our way in, displace the people, take the land, and establish colonies. And then make the people work for us on their own land, on reserves or reservations. Sometimes squatting, which is similar to sharecropping. So a lot of stuff was going on that we really don't know about that colonization brought. So there was a lot of suffering. And during the 1960s and in Africa, on the continent, those nations were clamoring and they were protesting for independence. After World War II, so there were still colonies and there were great atrocities being committed in many of the locations. So during the 1960s, there was a move for African countries to fight for their freedom. So during this time, Dar es Salaam became a hub or a headquarters for these African liberation movements. So there's a story about someone you may not know about. There's an African American who never went home. He lives in Arusha with his wife. He was originally or formerly a Black Panther, and He moved to Tanzania in 1972 and has not set foot in the United States since, where he still lives there. He's about 85 years old. He was in exile. He fled the country because of some legal trouble that he had with carrying a firearm and taking it across state lines, which carrying firearms during those times, it was legal until the Black Panther Party started using them for self-defense during that time, during the Civil Rights Movement. There was a lot of brutality and a lot of physical attacks that the African American community was subject to. But not only African Americans, there were Puerto Rican communities that were subject to brutality as well. And during this time, I believe it was in Chicago, but the Lords bonded with the Panthers, and that was something that the FBI could not abide by because they started working together. But back to Tanzania and Mr. O'Neill. Pete O'Neill. He led the Kansas City chapter of the Black Panther Party. And because of that legal trouble, they tried to throw him in jail. They changed the law within 2 weeks of him doing it before. And they were going to sentence him to prison. And he and his wife left the country and wound up in Tanzania. His first stop, I believe, was Algeria. And before he got to Tanzania. But he's been in Tanzania ever since. He lives outside of Arusha. And Arusha is a city where every safari begins, just about. Most safaris begin in Arusha. So the story beneath the safari, okay? And this is the story about Tanzania that nobody tells. I help empty nesters travel with heart, heritage, soul, and adventure, okay? So by the time I'm done with this, you will never look at Tanzania the same, or even your own history the same, ever again. And this is actually the beginning of a series. And just follow. You will see announcements if you follow me on how to sign up. This one didn't require any registration at all, but the following presentations will. So just follow me. And if you want to sign up, then you can sign up. If you're on my email list, you will automatically get an invitation. And if you sign up for the following presentations or the following episodes, then you'll automatically get a reminder if you sign up. So this is the story beneath the safari. So generally, for African Americans and some Caribbean Americans as well, we think of Ghana when we think of going to the continent. And we think of Ghana and the door of no return. So that is a point of reference for us because we, after all this time, Ghana has opened its doors to tourism and has invited people, the diaspora, to come back and visit and reconnect with their heritage. Now, you may not be from Ghana per se, but it is West Africa, with most of the Africans who were trafficked during the transatlantic slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade came from West Africa, West and Southern Africa. So we know a lot more about West Africa. And we also know about South Africa because of the freedom struggle and Nelson Mandela of South Africa and apartheid. That was pretty recent when apartheid ended in the 80s. So yeah, it was pretty recent. I believe I was an adult when that happened. Now, Tanzania is the chapter that no one taught us about. There's a threat between American civil rights for African Americans. Then there's a movement called the Black Power movement that also began in the 1960s. Then from there, we have Pan-Africanism. And I was alive during these things. Like I mentioned before, I was very young, but I do remember my parents, and I definitely remember my father talking about it because my father was a part of the New York um, Panther Party. Now, I don't know which chapter or how many chapters there were then because I was too young. I do remember that. And I remember my mother telling him to be careful. My father was very, 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 he was a little militant, and but he was very pro-black. And my parents were both. My mother was from the South, South Carolina. My father was from Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. And they both were pro-black, and they were very much active and fought in the fight for civil rights. Most people were, mostly young people, because some people had to work. Now, my grandparents didn't get a chance to vote until they were in their 60s. So that should let you know that anybody who's saying, oh, these things happened so long ago, no, they weren't. They were definitely not. I was actually born during a time when these things, these struggles were going on. So my children, my sister's children, and my brother's children are the first generation in our immediate family to whose children were born completely free. However, there are factions right now who are trying to reverse that. So we have to remember. So even though this show and this business is travel related, I'm still taking the opportunity to remind people, remind myself, and talk about and remember where we were then, you know, think about it, because some of the skills and the things and the activists, the things that they did then are relevant now. They may change a little bit because our world is different. However, it's still the same struggle, and we're just not going back. So we're going to learn about it, even if it's related to travel, because it is. Our world is interconnected, and there is nothing wrong with that because we are connected more than you think. All right, so here's the through line. During the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement was about the vote and equality under the law, meaning that the right to vote. African Americans were denied the right to vote in the Deep South, okay? And they were faced with violence. They were not faced with what we're seeing now, although it was a strategy, gerrymandering. They were actually faced with violence. Not only violence, but unfair laws designed to keep them from exercising their rights as Americans. Equality under the law, meaning desegregation in public spaces. So I know there's a lot of talk about segregation and all of that now, but segregation was more than just, oh, I have my space and you have your space. No, it wasn't that. It was like American apartheid. African Americans were denied access to public spaces, but yet we still had to pay taxes. We were denied access to equal education, to voting rights, even going to the store, trying on shoes, things that we do right now all the time. Black people couldn't do that. You had to take a paper bag, draw the outline of your foot on the paper bag and take that to the clothing store because Black people weren't allowed to try on shoes. Black people weren't considered completely human. Many of the people in the South wanted and were still resentful about losing the Civil War and losing their property. So they had a system of sharecropping in Africa. It's similar to squatting, right? Where it's a system where they were forced into it. So I've done a little bit of heritage and ancestry digging in my own family. Like I mentioned earlier, my mom's family was from South Carolina. My great-great-grandmother was a formerly enslaved woman. My great-great-grandparents, I found a labor contract during Reconstruction where she had to work because there were laws, even though they were freed by the war. The South was like it was destroyed. It was economically destroyed by the war. And so some of the farmers, they wanted labor. So the Freedmen's Bureau was stationed in these places, which granted protection to the newly freed refugees, because that's what we were. We were refugees. We left with nothing, okay? Just like many refugees that we see coming from other countries, like Ukraine, like maybe Congo, people who are fleeing either for famine, places in South America, because of wars, maybe famine, other economic reasons which make it unlivable. Maybe they're living under a dictatorship and they're not safe, so they leave. And many people from the Middle East who fought alongside or with the United States during the Gulf Wars became refugees because they had to leave after the United States left. And many, many reasons. There are many, many reasons, many, many different groups of people who could be considered refugees. But African Americans were refugees in the United States. A lot of times people don't think about that, but we were refugees. So the Freedmen's Bureau actually negotiated work contracts for the newly freed people who couldn't read because it was illegal. It was illegal to read, which is another reason why there's always a fight against education, right? There's always an effort to tear down education because from way back, from when people were enslaved, they always knew that they needed to learn how to read. They always wanted education, and that was denied them because they knew that if they could read, then they would know what was happening. But that didn't stop us from knowing what was happening. So you should read Frederick Douglass's first autobiography. And he talks a lot about his life as an enslaved person and once he became free and how he learned to read. And he became a great orator and an abolitionist. So that was just a little bit of American history. So if you're not from America and you live here, maybe I helped you out a little bit there, or maybe you just didn't learn it yourself or you forgot about it. So these things are important now, especially in the time that we are living in right now. And we're getting to Tanzania because there is a through line. There's a thread that we can pull that relates our struggles. And you may not know that because you may have forgotten because you weren't here. Maybe your grandparents or your parents are no longer living. So you may not have understood what they were doing when they were wearing their dashikis. And when there was a whole bunch of Kwames being named after Kwame Nkrumah, there were a whole lot of people named African names during that time. And then we have Kwanzaa. That is a holiday during the end of the year in December. And that's another story for another one of my, another episode. But the words that she used were Swahili words. So there is a through line. So if you wonder why, when you look at your old pictures and you see your parents wearing dashikis and wearing Afrocentric clothing, it's because of that time. The Black Power movement came after the civil rights. So the civil rights movement sort of bled into the Black Power movement, and that kicked off or bled into the Pan-African movement because of what was going on politically. So after the civil rights movement, or during that time, sort of there was a transition for some, where the Black Power movement kicked off in the 1960s. And the first person to make it popular was Stokely Carmichael. His name is Kwame Ture, because once he left the United States, he renamed himself. And he was a part of the the civil rights movement. And he went to many, many, many sit-ins and many, many non-violent protests. And he believed that Black Power meant that not only should we have equal rights, but what good is that if we can't keep them? And he felt that we need to have political power, as well as the ability to determine our own future. And we deserve dignity, not just treated the way that African Americans were treated, which was awful, pretty awful, very violent. A lot of things happened during that time and before on why the struggle, our people continued to struggle. After Reconstruction, it lasted about 10 or 12 years. After President Lincoln was assassinated, there was, a movement to try to go back to the way things were before. And that's when you see the rise of the Klan. That's the second instance of the Klan. And that's when legalized segregation, that's what made it different. The legalization of discrimination against Black people, Black Americans. There were laws put in place to disenfranchise Black people from voting, from accessing public spaces, from education, from economics, meaning the ability to move up like any person wants to, the ability to buy homes and have farms and care for your families. Those things were constantly being destroyed. So now, of course, you probably see lots of stories now about many of the massacres that happened to African Americans and lynchings that happened to African Americans over the decades. And there were over 3,000 lynchings in the United States. And if you visit the lynching museum in Montgomery, Alabama, I haven't been yet, but I intend to go. Then you will be able to see this monument that honors the people who's had their lives unjustly taken from them because of jealousy and racism, white supremacist racism. That's really what racism is. It's white supremacy. And the African was put at the bottom of that hierarchy. And all these efforts were to try to place the African back at the bottom of the hierarchy. So what we see now is it's just another effort to do the same. So it's this backlash that continues to happen and over time. And unless we talk about it and look at history, you'll be shocked and you'll think this is something new. And I know people who are not African American, they're shocked as well. So they may not have been able to see it before, but they can see it now. But one thing is for sure, that whatever happens to African Americans is going to happen to everyone, because our society is an integrated society. And we don't live in a segregated life. We don't have a segregated country, even though some people think we should try to do that again. But that's going to be almost impossible to do that again. And we're just not going to go for that anymore anyway. So a lot has happened, like the Black Power movement. And with the Black Power movement came the Black Panthers, who were for self-defense. So we all have Second Amendment rights. We have Second Amendment rights too. So take advantage of it. So Pan-Africanism came after Black Power. It's one struggle, one destiny across the ocean. So many of the activists who were civil rights activists became upset or disillusioned because they were fighting for so long for civil rights, but yet they were still being attacked physically, shot at, beat, because of the nonviolent activism that they practiced under Martin Luther King and other activists. That's what they practiced, and still faced extreme violence. Churches were blown up. They were people attacked, children attacked. So these are things that happen. So in this country, and during the civil rights movement, that's what African Americans were fighting for: human rights, civil rights, to be treated equally, to have the same rights. And the Black Panthers were like, we don't need to pay taxes if we are not going to be treated equally. So Pan-Africanism. And that led to Dar es Salaam in 1974. That's where the Black world leaders gathered on African soil. And I was alive. I was in elementary school when that happened. So from Montgomery and Selma to Black Power, and then to Pan-Africanism, then it lands in Tanzania. How about that? The man who walked the whole line was Stokely Carmichael. Like I mentioned, later named Kwame Ture, and he passed away in 1998. He was the one who coined the term Black Power. He was the SNCC chairman. That's the Student Nonviolent Cooperation. So in 1966, there was a march called the Meredith March, and where this one young Black man, he decided, I'm going to walk for voting rights, to encourage Black people not to be afraid to go to the polls and register to vote. And he was walking, and he was shot 3 times. So at that time, Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, got very disillusioned, and he was like, I've been arrested like 27 times, thrown in jail, been in one of the most notorious prisons, and yet it's 6 years later and we're still going through this. We need Black Power. And that's when he kicked off the Black Power movement. It was around, but he coined the term Black Power, which led into Pan-Africanism, because that led them to Africa and linked up with the African liberation movement, because that's what was happening during this time. So the day the Black world came home in 1973, there was a 6th Pan-African Congress. The first 5 were never on African soil. It started a long time ago, Pan-Africanism, with people like W.E.B. Du Bois and other people from that time period, the Harlem Renaissance area, who were advocating for African independence, right? For the African nations to become free. So, but the 6th Pan-African Congress, for the first time, convened in 1973 in Dar es Salaam, which was hosted by President Julius Nyerere. He was the first president of Tanzania. And that's where it all began. So these were the SNCC veterans: Cortland Cox, Charlie Cobb, Jerry Augusto, and Jennifer Lawson. These people were a part of this 6th Pan-African Congress. People came from all over, leaders from the African diaspora, people from the Caribbean nations, we call them CARICOM now, the African nations, and African Americans. But the difference is that African Americans didn't have their own nation, so their voices were muted, because it was mostly these freedom movements that they were fighting for an end to colonization independently. But this is where the beginning of civil rights moving into Pan-Africanism. So, does this still resonate today? Does it resonate to you? Had you ever heard of this before? Have you ever heard about the liberation movement in Tanzania and how it's related? It started out with civil rights, moving to the Black Power movement, and then into Pan-Africanism. Let me know. Had you ever heard that before? So why am I talking about this now? Well, history is not nostalgia. This is a map, right? So this is a record of what our people did and how they made the ground shift beneath them. They went across the ocean and found family, found ideas, and a new blueprint. And guess what? That blueprint is still there. That blueprint is still there. That blueprint is still there. Okay, so I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, so that's why I have Charleston there. That is where the largest slave port was, of the largest number of enslaved Africans landed in Charleston, South Carolina, after first going to the Caribbean. So what's ahead? We'll be talking about Julius Nyerere, the president who gave up power willingly, and the Maji Maji rebellion. It was a huge rebellion, and it threatened colonial rule long before Tanzania became its own nation. And also, we'll be talking about the University of Dar es Salaam, the classroom that shook a continent, and the Panthers, Pete and Charlotte O'Neill, who live outside Arusha today. So, follow so you don't miss. So, share this video with someone who thinks they know all about Tanzania, but they might not actually know about it. So, tell me in the comments, what surprised you the most? And then I'll read them out. Out of everything that I talked about in this presentation, put in the comments what surprised you the most about Tanzania and learning about it. So again, my name is Priscilla with Cilla Travel, helping you live the dream through travel. And if you're interested at all in visiting Tanzania, there is a barcode on the screen, and that is Soulful Safari 2027. And you can scan that barcode and you can read all about the trip. But we'll be talking about it later. So let's see. I don't see any comments or any questions. But please follow so you don't miss the next topics that we talk about. Like I said, Soulful Safari, Tanzania. We don't just watch the wildlife. We are going to walk the ground where modern Africa was reimagined, and that's in Tanzania. My name is Priscilla with Cilla Travel, and I help you live the dream through travel. I help active adults, empty nesters, travel with heart, heritage, soul, and adventure. So that is all that I have for this evening. So thank you all for joining me. Those of you who will be watching on the replay, please, if you've got any comments or questions, make them and I will respond. And if you're on LinkedIn, I can't see the comments on that platform, but I will check them out afterwards. Thank you, Debbie. Debbie says it was a great presentation. I think it's great that you were here. Spread the word. It's time for us to revive history. It's relevant now. It's always been relevant, but it's really, really relevant now. Because we may need to have some tough conversations with our family members and our neighbors and things that we forgot, about some of the things that we forgot. So we need to become the storytellers in our communities. So we do have allies, but what can I say? You need to know it's for yourself and for your family, your loved ones, so they know where we came from. Not only that, it's also for other people who may come to the United States and not know much about African American history or American history, because it's, quite frankly, it's not really taught the way it's supposed to be taught. That's why we're always talking about ourselves, because we're going to tell the narrative. We're not going to let someone else tell the narrative about us. Time out for that. There are just too many books out there. And speaking of books, I ordered this one, Black Power, and it is by Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, and Charles V. Hamilton. Black Power, the Politics of Liberation. So Yeah. So that's what I'll be reading. And also ordered a couple of books by Kwame Nkrumah so I can understand his philosophy. So this is Priscilla with Cilla Travel, helping you live the dream through travel. And I'm glad that you decided to visit me today and listen to this live and get energized. We're really one people. I didn't mention that Stokely Carmichael was actually a Trinidadian American. He moved to the United States and lived in the Bronx. And he became radicalized in the 60s when he went to college and he saw what was going on in the South to Black people. He had no idea. So it was college students, Student Nonviolent Cooperation Committee. That's the name of it, SNCC. So SNCC organized many of the sit-ins, the freedom rides throughout the South, protests after the Woolworth's counter in North Carolina, where these 4 college students sat in protest at the Woolworth's counter. They used to serve food back in those days. And they lived through those protests. That was the beginning. Black people just got sick and tired. My mom told me that Black people had to go to the back of the restaurant. They were not allowed to eat in restaurants with white people. They had to go around to the back to the window. She used to work for a bus station in Walterboro, South Carolina. And she worked in there and people would sit down. She said it was really nice, but all the Black people had to go to the window and get takeout. They weren't allowed to eat. And she said that just made her so angry. She hated that so much and she hated that job. And after desegregation occurred in public spaces, because that's what it was really about. Black people couldn't eat in restaurants. They couldn't try on shoes. They couldn't, they would steal your money if you deposited your money in banks. You had to step off the side of the road. When a white person came, you had to step off the curb, look down. You couldn't look a white person in the eye. All these things, you could be brutalized. They could come and burn your house down and the law would not protect you. That is what segregation did and meant. We had no rights. We did not have civil or human rights. So, and if a Black community did thrive, or there was some Black community members who may have become store owners or business owners, any little thing would cause them to burn the people's store down and unalive them. Shopkeepers. There were so many instances where African Americans built wealth for themselves and their families, and it was destroyed. Tulsa is just one. It was a massacre, not a riot. It was a massacre. It was a suburb that was destroyed because they were prosperous. They had their own. That's not the only place that this happened. So what you may not know is that similar things happen on the continent to African people under colonization. Yeah. So when I started looking it up, I was completely shocked to find out the similarities. Not exactly the same, because it's going to be different in the different countries, but such brutality. Just terrible. So that's where the idea of Pan-Africanism came about during that time, because we do have a shared struggle. So this is Priscilla with Cilla Travel, helping you live the dream through travel. And I'm glad that you decided to join me today. So remember, follow me and look out for an invitation to the next episode. And that one you'll have to register for. This was just an intro. And this is what we'll be talking about going on from here, from now on, until I feel like we've done enough. Because it's time that we educate ourselves and educate our family in our community and stick together, okay? Regardless of where we come from, whether it be the Caribbean, whether it be the continent, we need to stick together. That's what Pan-Africanism means. So, thank you for joining me. This is Priscilla again, signing off, hoping that you had a great experience on this presentation. I'm glad that you joined. Hope to see you again. And remember, as always, live the dream. Bye-bye.